My dear friends, before we start, I asked you all to press a like and leave your comment. This will help a lot to promote this video and to release news stories as soon as possible. It's not hard for you, but it's a pleasure for me. Thank you. My name is Michael Evans, and if you had asked me a week ago, I'd tell you my life was as mundane as anyone else's. I worked a regular job, paid my rent on time, and lived alone in a small apartment in a quiet area called Stillwater. It was one of those neighborhoods where nothing exciting ever happened, until that night. It started with a knock on my front door. A steady, relentless knock that pulled me out of a deep sleep. I glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. My heart pounded louder than I wanted to admit as I tried to shake off the fog of sleep. Who on earth would knock on someone's door at this hour? The knocking continued, louder this time. I got up, cautiously, and made my way toward the door. Halfway there, a woman's voice broke through the unsettling silence. "Open up quickly!" Her voice sounded frantic, like she was in some kind of danger. Instinctively, my hand reached for the lock, but something felt wrong. The urgency in her tone was over the top, unnatural, almost. My fingers hesitated, and in the quiet moment that followed, I heard the voice again. "Please open up." But this time, her voice was different. Deeper. Rougher. A chill crept down my spine, and I pulled my hand away from the door, stepping back as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't see through the peephole. It was too dark. But I wasn't alone anymore. There was an eerie feeling, as if something, or someone, was watching me from the other side of the door. The knocking stopped for a brief moment, only to start up again, more violent this time. The woman, or whatever it was now pounding on the door, demanding that I let her in. I backed away, every instinct in me screaming to keep that door shut. "Open up!" The voice roared again, but this time, it sounded less human, like a growl creeping through clenched teeth. I wasn't about to find out what was out there. My mind was racing, and fear gripped me hard. It wasn't a woman anymore. It couldn't be. I sat down on the floor, my back against the heavy wooden cabinet by the entrance, and tried to breathe quietly. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to the pounding that seemed to reverberate through the whole apartment. Then, it just stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I held my breath, terrified that the quiet was just a trick. The creature on the other side of the door was waiting for me to make a sound. I could feel it. The darkness in my apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me from all sides. It was like the shadows were creeping closer, swallowing everything around me. Suddenly, I heard a door creak open from the floor below. My neighbor's door. Then I heard footsteps, heavy ones. My heart jumped into my throat as the creature moved again, and I braced myself for what was coming next. A scream tore through the silence, a sound so raw and desperate that it made my blood run cold. It was followed by the sound of someone, being dragged. And then, just as suddenly, silence again. I was paralyzed with fear, every nerve in my body on edge. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was out there wasn't done. It would come back. For what felt like hours, I sat there, huddled in the dark, waiting for that knock to return. Waiting for the next scream. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the darkness weighing down on me. The only thing that broke the silence was the soft, rhythmic sound of my own heartbeat. And then, the knocking returned. It was slower this time, but more deliberate. Like whatever, was out there knew I was still inside and was taking its time. I wasn't about to let it in. I forced myself to move as quietly as possible, creeping toward the door to the peephole. I needed to know what I was dealing with. The peephole was small, but what I saw through it nearly made me lose my breath. Standing in the dim light of the hallway was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and hunched over, with long, twisted limbs that didn't seem to belong to any human. Its skin was dark and mottled, almost like rusted metal, and it shimmered in the faint light. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed faintly, 2 pinpoints of light that cut through the darkness. It was staring right at me, and I knew then that it could sense me, even if I didn't make a sound. The creature's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and it licked its lips hungrily as if it knew exactly what I wanted. I stumbled backward, terror surging through my veins. The creature slammed against the door, rattling it so hard that I thought it might give way. The sound was deafening, and I knew that if it managed to break through, I didn't stand a chance. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The apartment fell into an eerie silence. I didn't dare move. I sat back down against the wall, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to disappear into the shadows. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd wake up soon, and this would all just be some terrible nightmare. But the cold sweat running down my back told me otherwise. The minutes stretched on, and still, nothing happened. No more pounding. No more growling. Just silence. I couldn't even hear the usual noises from the street outside. No cars, no people, nothing. It was like the whole world had gone quiet. Then I heard something else. A scratching noise, faint but persistent, coming from behind the door. My breath itched in my throat as the sound grew louder, more insistent, like claws dragging across the metal surface of the door. I held my breath, trying not to move, trying not to make a sound. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, until finally it stopped. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went still. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. Time seemed to blur together, and I lost track of the hours. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have passed out because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of voices outside my door. I glanced at the clock. 10:42 a.m. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream, but when I looked at the door, my stomach dropped. The paneling was stripped away, the metal underneath dented and scarred, like something had been clawing at it all night. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the hallway. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the stairs, smeared across the floor. Pieces of doors had been torn away, and several apartments were wide open. I stepped carefully over something that looked like a bone, my heart racing. The police arrived shortly after, and they told me that something had broken into 7 apartments during the night. No one had survived. And as for the creature, they had no explanation. But I knew what I had seen. Stillwater wasn't the quiet neighborhood it once was. I stood there, staring down the hallway in disbelief. My mind struggled to piece together what had happened during the night. I wasn't sure if it was the sheer terror or the adrenaline from earlier, but everything around me felt surreal. The cold morning air wafting through the open windows carried a metallic scent. The faint sound of the police radio crackling down below on the street snapped me out of my haze. I took a shaky breath and forced myself to move, my legs heavy with fear. I could hear officers downstairs talking in hushed tones, but their words blurred into white noise. As I approached the stairs, my foot brushed against something soft and wet. Looking down, I felt my stomach churn, a piece of torn clothing, soaked in blood. The fabric looked familiar, and that's when I realized it was from Mr. Clark, my neighbor from 2 floors down. He always wore the Michaela Brown jacket when he took his dog out for a walk. Panic set in again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't fall apart now. I needed to understand what had happened. As I made my way downstairs, I saw the officers gathered around the entrance, their faces grim. One of them, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a serious expression, noticed me coming down the stairs and approached. Her name tag read Officer Curtis. "Sir, I need you to stay inside your apartment," she said firmly but not unkindly, holding out her hand as if to stop me from going any further. What happened? What is this?" I stammered, looking around at the walls and the remnants of shattered doors. Was it an animal attack? Officer Curtis exchanged a look with her partner, a younger man named Officer Daniels, who had a clipboard in hand, jotting down notes. "We're still trying to figure that out," she replied, but her eyes told me she wasn't convinced it was something that simple. "There's been some unusual activity in the area lately." "Unusual?" I echoed. "That thing that was outside my door last night, it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either." The words came out before I could stop them, and as soon as they did, I regretted it. I must have sounded like I was losing it. Officer Curtis raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss me outright. "What exactly did you see?" I hesitated. How could I describe something like that without sounding crazy? It was tall. Like really tall. Its skin looked like rusted metal, and its eyes, they glowed. I swallowed, realizing how ridiculous it all sounded when spoken aloud. It tried to break into my apartment. There was a pause as Officer Curtis studied my face. Then she motioned to her partner, who stepped forward with his clipboard. "We're going to need you to give us a full statement," Officer Daniels said, his tone neutral but professional. "Anything you can remember from last night will help." I nodded, though my mind was still swirling with 1,000 questions. Could I really trust the police to handle this? Would they even believe me? As I started recounting the events of the previous night, another officer appeared from around the corner, leading someone toward the scene. It was my landlord, Mr. Hill, a short, wiry man with a perpetually worried expression. "Mr. Wright, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I came as soon as I heard there was trouble in the building." "I don't know what happened," I said, my voice shaky. "There was something out there last night, something not human. And now this." Mr. Hill's face went pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the scene. "This building has been here for years. Nothing like this has ever happened before," he muttered, almost to himself. "Stillwater's a quiet place. Always has been. Not anymore," I replied quietly, my eyes scanning the floors. The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me. Millie, I hadn't heard from her since the night before. She was supposed to come over for dinner, but I had canceled last minute because I wasn't feeling well. She lived just a few blocks away, but I hadn't checked my phone since the incident. "Excuse me, I need to check something," I said to the officers, pulling out my phone and stepping back toward the stairwell. I scrolled through my messages, searching for any sign that she was okay. No new texts. No calls. Panic surged in my chest again. I called her number, but it went straight to voicemail. "Millie, it's Michael. Are you okay? Something's happening in Stillwater. Call me as soon as you get this, please." I hung up and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. But it didn't. "Everything all right?" Officer Curtis asked, noticing my expression. "I'm trying to get a hold of a friend," I replied, barely keeping the anxiety out of my voice. "She lives nearby, but I can't reach her." Officer Curtis nodded sympathetically. "We've set up a perimeter around the neighborhood. We'll be conducting door-to-door checks, but if you have any concerns, let us know." The officers left me to my thoughts as they continued their investigation. I needed to find Millie. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had terrorized my apartment last night wasn't done yet, and I wasn't going to wait around for it to come back. After the police cleared the scene, I packed a few essentials into a backpack, just in case, and made my way toward Millie's apartment. The streets of Stillwater were eerily quiet, far too quiet for a morning that should have been filled with the usual hustle and bustle of people going to work or walking their dogs. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning every alleyway and shadow for signs of movement. When I reached Millie's building, something immediately felt off. The front door to the complex was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. My stomach dropped. I rushed up the stairs to her apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. "Millie?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. "Millie, it's Michael." There was no response. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar, and with a shaky hand, I pushed it open. What I saw inside made my heart stop. The apartment was a wreck. Furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and most disturbingly, the claw marks I'd seen on my own door were etched into the walls. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any sign of Millie. "Millie?" I called out again, my voice barely a whisper. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled noise coming from the bedroom. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed toward the sound, flinging the bedroom door open. There, huddled in the corner, was Millie. Her eyes were wide with terror, her hands covering her ears as if trying to block out something horrible. "Millie!" I rushed to her side, dropping to my knees. "It's me, it's Michael. What happened?" She looked up at me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "It came from me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That thing, it's real, Michael. It's real." I swallowed hard, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I know," I whispered. "I saw it too. We sat there in the wreckage of her apartment, the reality of the situation crashing down on us both. Whatever had terrorized Stillwater wasn't going away. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The following days were a blur. The police investigation yielded no answers, and the media was quick to label the incident as an animal attack, despite the mounting evidence that suggested something far more sinister. The residents of Stillwater were uneasy, but most went about their daily lives as if trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over the town. But I couldn't ignore it. Neither could Millie. We spent hours researching, trying to find anything that could explain the creature we had both seen, legends, folklore, anything that might give us a clue as to what we were dealing with. It wasn't long before we came across stories of an ancient being, an entity known as Faint Ooze. The descriptions matched the creature almost exactly. Tall, twisted, with glowing eyes and an insatiable hunger for flesh. But the worst part, Faint Ooze was said to be drawn to fear. It thrived on it, using its eerie call to lure its victims closer before devouring them whole. This can't be real, Millie muttered, scrolling through the online forums. It's too much. I wish it wasn't real, I said, my voice hollow. But we both saw it. We know what it's capable of. As the days passed, the attacks became more frequent. More reports of strange sightings and disappearances flooded the news, but Stillwater remained in denial. The authorities were powerless to stop it. And then, one night, it came back. That night was colder than usual, and the air had a biting chill that crept into my bones. Millie and I had been on edge for days, expecting Faint Ooze to return. I had boarded up my windows and reinforced the front door as best as I could, but nothing felt secure anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, made my heart race. We were huddled in my living room, the faint glow of the television casting eerie shadows across the walls. Millie sat beside me, knees pulled to her chest, her eyes darting toward every shadow, every flicker of movement outside the window. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered, her voice strained. "It's like we're just waiting to die." I reached over, taking her hand in mine. "We're not going to die," I said, trying to sound confident, though my own fear was gnawing at me. "We'll figure something out. We always do." She looked at me, her eyes filled with doubt. "What if we can't? What if it's already too late?" Before I could answer, there was a sound, a distant, faint wail that sent a shiver down my spine. It was unmistakable. Millie's grip on my hand tightened, her knuckles turning white. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's here." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Stay calm," I whispered back, though the panic in my chest was rising fast. "We'll stay quiet. Maybe it won't find us." But even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. Faint Ooze had a way of sensing its prey, of sniffing out fear like a predator hunting in the night. And we were sitting ducks. Millie clapped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. "Make it stop," she whimpered. "Please, make it stop." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't. The truth was, I was just as terrified as she was. I stood up, moving toward the window, careful to keep low. Peeking through a crack in the boarded-up window, I saw it, the towering, rust-colored figure of Faint Ooze, looming at the end of the street. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Its hunched, emaciated frame seemed to blend into the night, its skin almost camouflaged against the darkness. Its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, were scanning the houses, searching. And then, without warning, it turned toward us. My heart leapt into my throat as I ducked down, pressing my back against the wall. I motioned for Millie to stay quiet, but her face was pale, and her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "It's here," I mouthed silently to her. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in silence, listening to the sound of Faint Ooze's movements outside. The ground seemed to shake with each step it took. And then, just when I thought it might pass by, there was a deafening crash. The entire apartment shook, and I heard the sound of wood splintering. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Faint Ooze had found us. Millie let out a small, involuntary gasp, and I immediately knew we were in trouble. The sound was barely a whisper, but it was enough. Enough for it to hear. The wailing stopped, replaced by an eerie, deathly silence. It was as if the entire world had gone still, waiting. I held my breath, not daring to move. Millie's eyes met mine, filled with terror, and I could see the realization in her gaze. We weren't going to make it. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I heard the unmistakable creak of the front door being pushed open. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, no, no." Faintuz was inside. The floorboards creaked under its weight as it moved closer, the sound of its distorted breathing filling the room. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Millie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to hide." I mouthed to her, barely able to form the words. But where? There was nowhere to go. Nowhere that could possibly keep us safe from this thing. Suddenly, there was a crash from the kitchen. Pots and pans clattered to the floor, and for a split second, I thought we were done for. But then I realized, it wasn't us it was after. It was searching. I motioned for Millie to follow me, crawling toward the small closet at the back of the room. It wasn't much, but it was the only option we had. We slipped inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. In the darkness of the closet, we could hear Faintuz moving through the apartment, its massive frame brushing against the walls, knocking over furniture as it searched for us. I held my breath, trying to keep my mind from spiraling into panic. Millie was shaking beside me, her breathing shallow and rapid. I reached over and squeezed her hand, trying to offer some form of comfort, though I had no idea if we were going to survive this. Minutes felt like hours as we listened to the creature tearing through the apartment. At one point, it was so close I could hear the faint crackling of its voice, the mechanical hum that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. And then, just as suddenly as it had entered, it stopped. The apartment fell eerily silent once again. We waited, listening for any sign of movement, any clue that Faintuz was still nearby. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. "I think it's gone," I whispered. Millie didn't reply, but I could feel her grip on my hand loosening slightly. Cautiously, I opened the closet door, peeking out into the dimly lit apartment. Everything was in shambles, but Faintuz was nowhere to be seen. I helped Millie to her feet, and we stood there for a moment, taking in the destruction. "What now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from fear. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling just as lost as she was. "We can't stay here. It knows where we are." She nodded in agreement, but her face was still pale, her eyes distant. "Where do we go?" "I don't know," I repeated, frustration and fear gnawing at me. "But we can't stay here." We quickly gathered a few essentials, water, food, anything we could carry, and prepared to leave. But as we reached the front door, we froze. This voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. "It's still out there," Millie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I felt the Michaela cold dread creeping up my spine. "We have to move," I said, my voice firm. "We can't wait for it to come back." We slid out the back door, moving as quietly as possible to the alley behind the building. The streets were empty, but the oppressive silence lingered, and every shadow felt like it was watching us. As we made our way through Stillwater, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't just some random attack. Faintuz was hunting us. It was toying with us, drawing us out into the open. And I had no idea how to stop it. Hours passed as we moved through the town, sticking to the shadows and avoiding any open spaces. We couldn't shake the feeling that Faintuz was always just a step behind us, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time we reached the edge of town, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. We had made it to the woods that bordered Stillwater, but I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. "Are you sure about this?" Millie asked, her voice shaky as we approached the tree line. I glanced over at her, seeing the fear etched into her face. I didn't blame her. The woods felt like they were closing in on us, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, ready to pull us into the darkness. But what other choice did we have? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice heavy with uncertainty. "But it's our best shot. We can't stay in the open." She hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward the distant horizon, where the sun was rapidly disappearing behind the mountains. but then she nodded, her resolve hardening. Okay, let's go. We plunged into the woods, the branches scratching at our arms and legs as we moved deeper into the trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every rustle of the leaves sent my heart racing. For a while, it seemed like we might